The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on November 13, 1902. What the residents of Hollowbend, West Virginia found the next morning would haunt their dreams for decades to come. This is the story of a family whose name was deliberately erased from county records, whose crimes were so unspeakable that an entire community chose collective amnesia over justice. The autumn mist clung to the mountainside like wet wool, carrying the scent of rotting leaves and something else, something metallic that made the horses refuse to climb higher. Percival Ravenscroft, the traveling preacher who'd arrived in Hollowbend that October, would later describe the texture of fear as thick enough to chew. He'd come seeking souls to save in the remote Appalachian settlement. Instead, he found a town that had been saving something far more sinister. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if this story sends chills down your spine like it did mine, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover gets so much darker from here. Hollowbend sat in a natural bowl between three peaks, accessible only by a single winding trail that serpentined through dense hemlock and rhododendron. The settlement had been established in 1868 by families fleeing the chaos of Reconstruction, seeking isolation in the Cumberland Mountains. By 1900, it housed 43 souls who lived by subsistence farming, moonshine, distilling, and an unspoken code of silence. At the heart of this community stood the Netherwood homestead, a sprawling collection of log buildings connected by covered walkways, built against the mountainside like a wooden tumor. Cyrus Netherwood had arrived first in 1871, claiming to be a widowed farmer with 3 children. The townspeople of Hollowbend welcomed him, grateful for another strong back and willing hands. They had no way of knowing that Cyrus Netherwood wasn't his real name. State records from that period, discovered only in 1978 during a university genealogy project, revealed troubling inconsistencies. A man matching Cyrus's description had been wanted in connection with a series of disappearances in eastern Kentucky. 3 families, the Hawthorns, the Caseys, and the Donnellys, had vanished from their homesteads over a 2-year period, leaving behind meals still warm on their tables and livestock dead in their pens. But in Hollowbend, Cyrus Netherwood was simply a neighbor who kept to himself, who always had meat to trade when hunting grew scarce, and whose children Dorcas, Elijah, and little Agatha seemed older than their years, and quieter than most mountain children had any right to be. The first sign of trouble came during the harsh winter of 1874, when the Murphy family's cabin was found empty after a blizzard. Vernon Blackstone, who served as the settlement's unofficial constable, organized a search party. They found tracks leading from the Murphy place toward the Netherwood property, but Cyrus claimed he'd seen nothing, heard nothing. The tracks, he suggested, probably belonged to wolves. Wolves don't wear boots. That spring, when the snow melted, pieces of the Murphy family's belongings began appearing in Netherwood Creek: a child's rag doll, a woman's bone comb, a man's leather belt with distinctive brass buckles. Each item was discovered by different residents, but when they brought their concerns to Vernon Blackstone, he seemed strangely reluctant to investigate further. What they didn't know was that Vernon had already paid a visit to the Netherwood homestead. What he'd seen there had convinced him that some mysteries were better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. The surviving fragment of his personal journal, found in 1953, tucked inside the walls of his demolished cabin, contains only one entry about that visit. God forgive me. I looked the other way. The children's eyes. They ain't children's eyes no more. Some things can't be fought with law and bullets. Some things got to be endured. By 1876, the Netherwood clan had grown. Cyrus had taken a wife, Selina Drayton, a pale, hollow-eyed woman who'd appeared one morning claiming to be his mail-order bride from back east. The townspeople noticed she never received letters, never spoke of family, and flinched whenever anyone asked about her past. The children had grown too. Dorcas, now 16, had developed a reputation for midwifery, though babies born under her care had an alarming tendency to die within their first year. Elijah, 14, was known for his skill at butchering livestock and for the way he smiled while he worked. Young Agatha, barely 12, had become the settlement's most successful trapper, though she never explained how she lured so many animals to their deaths. Then came Matthias Culpepper, a federal tax collector from Charleston. Matthias arrived in Hollowbend on September 5, 1876, with a leather satchel full of assessment forms and the authority of the United States government behind him. He'd been sent to investigate reports of significant unreported income in the settlement rumors of a major moonshine operation that was somehow evading federal taxation. His first stop, naturally, was the Netherwood homestead, which sat on the most productive farmland in the Hollow and somehow always had the best-fed livestock. Matthias Culpepper was last seen alive on September 7, 1876, walking up the trail toward the Netherwood property with his satchel under his arm and a federal warrant in his coat pocket. His horse returned to town 3 days later, riderless and wild-eyed, with claw marks on its flanks that didn't match any known mountain predator. But here's what the residents of Hollowbend couldn't have known, what wouldn't be discovered for another 40 years. Matthias Culpepper wasn't the first federal agent to disappear in those mountains. He was the seventh. What had the Netherwoods been hiding that was worth killing federal agents to protect? And more importantly, why had an entire town chosen to remain silent about a family that was clearly hunting human prey? The answers lay buried beneath the Netherwood homestead, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig. Blood doesn't lie, even when every witness refuses to tell the truth. In November 1876, 2 months after Matthias Culpepper vanished, his replacement arrived in Hollowbend with questions that no one wanted to answer. The disappearance of federal agents had finally attracted the attention of someone who wouldn't be silenced by mountain superstition or local politics. The November air bit sharp against exposed skin, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the damp earthiness of fallen leaves rotting beneath early frost. Special Agent Francesca Whitlow's boots crunched through the brittle undergrowth as she approached the Netherwood homestead for the first time. She'd been expecting the usual mountain hospitality, suspicious but ultimately cooperative once official credentials were presented. What she found instead was a family that watched her approach with the predatory stillness of wolves evaluating prey. Francesca had been investigating missing federal personnel for 3 years, a grim specialty that had taken her from the logging camps of Oregon to the coal mines of Pennsylvania. She developed an instinct for danger, a sixth sense that had kept her alive in situations where other agents had simply vanished. As she climbed the narrow trail toward the Netherwood compound, every instinct she possessed was screaming. The homestead itself defied easy categorization. What had started as a simple log cabin had grown into something organic and unsettling. Rooms added without apparent plan, walkways connecting buildings that served no obvious purpose, and everywhere the smell of meat curing in the smokehouses that dotted the property like wooden tombstones. Cyrus Netherwood greeted her at his door with a smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him, his wife Selena hovered in the shadows, and his children watched from windows with expressions far too calculating for their ages. When Francesca explained she was investigating the disappearance of Matthias Culpepper, Cyrus's response was immediate and rehearsed. Federal man came by, sure enough. But he left same day, heading toward the Tennessee border. Said something about chasing moonshine runners down that way. It was a lie so smooth, it had obviously been practiced. But it was also a lie that contradicted the official report filed by the town constable, Vernon Blackstone, who'd claimed Culpepper never reached the Netherwood property at all. Someone was lying. The question was whether it was incompetence or conspiracy. That evening, Francesca took lodging at the settlement's only boarding house, run by Lillian Eastchurch. a widow whose husband had died in a hunting accident 3 years prior. Over supper of venison stew and cornbread, Francesca began asking careful questions about the Netherwood family. The response was immediate and telling. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes found their plates. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "They keep to themselves," Lillian finally offered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good neighbors, though. Always willing to help when times get hard." "Help how?" Francesca pressed. "Food, mostly. Always got meat to share when hunting's poor. Death feeds the living here." But Bartleby Underwood, an elderly trapper who'd had too much corn liquor, let slip something more revealing. "Netherwoods got a powerful, strange way of hunting. Never seen 'em track game like normal folks, but they always come back with something." When Francesca asked him to elaborate, the old man's face went white. "I've said too much," he muttered, and fled the boarding house into the night. The next morning brought Francesca's first real break in the case. While examining the area where Culpepper's horse had been found, she discovered something the local constable had either missed or deliberately overlooked. A piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush, federal issue wool, from a tax collector's coat. More importantly, she found tracks. Not the random patterns of a man fleeing in panic, but the methodical impressions of someone being dragged. The trail led directly toward the Netherwood property, just as Vernon Blackstone's suppressed journal entry had suggested. Following those tracks required crossing onto Netherwood land, which meant confronting the family directly. Francesca had legal authority, but she was also alone in hostile territory, investigating people who had already made at least 7 federal agents disappear. At 10:30 a.m. on November 20th, 1876, she approached the main Netherwood cabin with her hand resting on her service revolver and a prayer on her lips. What she discovered in the root cellar beneath their smokehouse would eventually be documented in a classified federal report that wouldn't see daylight for nearly a century. But the immediate result was a gunfight that left 2 members of the Netherwood clan dead and sent the rest fleeing deeper into the mountains. Francesca Whitlow survived that confrontation, but she was never the same woman who'd arrived in Hollowbend 3 days earlier. Her official report, stamped classified national security and buried in federal archives, contained details so disturbing that they were deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. The report described what appeared to be an organized operation spanning multiple states and potentially decades, evidence of systematic murder, careful disposal of remains, and most chilling of all, signs that the Netherwood family had been perfecting their methods for generations. But the investigation raised as many questions as it answered. How had the Netherwoods operated for so long without detection? Who had been protecting them? And most disturbing of all, were they working alone, or was this part of something larger? Because Francesca Whitlow had discovered something in that root cellar that suggested the Netherwood family weren't just serial killers hiding in the mountains. They were part of a network, and Hollowbend was just one stop on a route that stretched across the entire Appalachian region. The evidence pointed to something so vast and horrifying that the federal government chose to classify the entire investigation rather than risk public panic. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed the surviving Netherwoods had been scattered and defeated. They were wrong. 3 bodies lay cooling in the November frost, but the real killing was just beginning. Within 48 hours of Agent Whitlow's raid, Hollowbend learned that attacking one Netherwood meant declaring war on them all. The Mountain Telegraph had carried news of the federal raid faster than any horse could travel, and now the surviving clan members were calling in debts that stretched back generations. The morning air hung sharp with the smell of pine sap and gunpowder residue, while frost crunched underfoot like broken glass. Amelia Rathborn picked her way through the debris of what had been the Netherwood compound, her breath forming pale clouds in the bitter cold. As the nearest thing Hollowbend had to a doctor, she'd been summoned to tend the wounded. But what she found defied medical explanation. Cyrus Netherwood lay dead with 3 bullet holes in his chest. but his face wore an expression of satisfaction rather than pain. His daughter Dorcas had taken a round through the heart, yet her hands were still warm, still clutching a bone-handled skinning knife. Most unsettling of all was young Elijah, barely 16, who died with a smile on his lips and another man's blood under his fingernails. Agent Whitlow had wounded 2 more family members before they fled into the deep woods. Selena Drayton and 12-year-old Agatha Penrose, who'd been living with the Netherwoods, under circumstances no one had bothered to investigate. The blood trail led up the mountain toward the old Cherokee hunting grounds, but even the most experienced trackers refused to follow. "Them woods don't give back what goes in," muttered Solomon Granville, the settlement's best hunter. "Especially not now." By December 1st, 1876, the residents of Hollowbend began to understand what Solomon meant. It started with the livestock. Harriet Tinsdale's prize milk cow was found butchered in her pasture, but not by any animal. The cuts were precise, surgical, and the choicest portions had been removed with professional skill. The message was clear: we can reach you anywhere. Then came the children. Orlando Whitford's 8-year-old son vanished from his own backyard on December 3rd, while playing within sight of the family cabin. The boys' tracks led to the tree line, where they were joined by barefoot prints too small to belong to an adult, but too purposeful to belong to another child. A search party found the boy 3 days later, alive but changed. He'd been fed and cared for, even bathed and dressed in clean clothes, but he couldn't or wouldn't speak about where he'd been or who had taken him. All he would say, over and over in a sing-song voice, was, "The lady in the woods says the debt ain't paid yet." The federal government's response was swift and decisive. They abandoned Hollowbend entirely. Agent Whitlow's classified report had reached Washington within a week of the raid, and the decision came down from the highest levels. Rather than risk more personnel in what appeared to be an organized resistance movement, the Department of Treasury would simply write off the mountain settlements as ungovernable territory. The official explanation was bureaucratic efficiency. The cost of maintaining federal presence in such remote areas exceeded any potential tax revenue. But the real reason was buried in Whitlow's report, in a section marked E. Weiss Only, Executive Level. Subject location appears to be center of organized criminal network spanning multiple states. Evidence suggests operation has been active for decades, possibly generations. Recommend immediate military intervention or complete withdrawal. Half measures will result in loss of additional personnel. The government chose withdrawal, but the Netherwood network had no intention of letting the matter rest. Within a month of the raid, similar incidents began occurring throughout the Appalachian region. Federal agents disappeared in Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. Tax collectors found their horses dead and their equipment destroyed. Revenue officers discovered their families' names carved into trees near their homes, always accompanied by detailed descriptions of their children's daily routines. The blood debt was being collected. Celestia Fairbairn, a postal inspector who'd worked the mountain routes for 15 years, later described the atmosphere. It was like the mountains themselves had turned hostile. Places that had been safe for decades suddenly felt dangerous. People who'd been cooperative started looking at federal badges like they were death warrants. The network's reach became apparent through a pattern of seemingly unrelated incidents. A revenue agent in Kentucky found his horse's throat cut and a note pinned to his saddle. Compliments of the Hollowbend Hospitality Committee. A tax assessor in Virginia discovered his office ransacked and his records burned, with a message scrawled on the wall. Some debts are paid in blood. Most chilling of all was the discovery made by Thackeray Blakemore, a federal marshal investigating the disappearance of 2 agents near the Tennessee border. Hidden in a cave system that local Cherokee guides refused to enter, he found what appeared to be a makeshift headquarters, maps marking federal agent routes, detailed surveillance notes on government personnel, and a ledger tracking what they called outstanding obligations. The ledger, written in multiple hands, contained entries spanning 23 years. Each page documented federal interference in what they termed family business, along with the retribution that followed. The Netherwood network hadn't been simply killing agents who stumbled onto their activities. They'd been waging a calculated campaign against federal authority in the mountains. They never stayed in one place. But here's what made the network truly terrifying. They weren't motivated by politics or ideology. According to the recovered documents, they were driven by something far more primitive and dangerous, a belief that they had the right to harvest human prey in their territory, and that anyone who interfered deserved the same fate. The final entry in the ledger, dated December 15, 1876, was written in a child's careful script. New teacher arriving Hollowbend, January. Federal woman, lives alone. Practice for Agatha. What the residents of Hollowbend didn't know was that their new schoolmarm had already been selected, not by the county education board, but by a 12-year-old girl who'd learned to hunt humans before she'd learned to read. And this time, they wouldn't make the same mistakes that had cost them Cyrus and the others. This time, they would be patient, careful, and utterly thorough in covering their tracks. The schoolhouse was already being prepared. The one-room schoolhouse had been empty for 3 years, but someone had been preparing it for company. Fresh chalk dust coated the blackboard, and 24 small desks sat in perfect rows, as if waiting for students who would never come. What the new teacher didn't realize was that she'd been hired not by the county education board, but by a child who'd learned arithmetic by counting bodies. The January wind howled through the gaps in the schoolhouse walls, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something sweeter like apples left too long in the root cellar. Miss Virginia Clemens adjusted her wool coat and surveyed her new domain with the optimism of a 23-year-old college graduate who believed education could civilize any wilderness. She'd traveled from Richmond with a trunk full of McGuffey readers and a head full of progressive ideas about mountain children needing proper schooling. Behind her, Vernon Blackstone set down her bags with hands that trembled slightly. As the settlement's constable, he'd been tasked with escorting the new teacher to her lodgings, but his eyes kept darting to the tree line, where shadows moved in ways that had nothing to do with wind. "You'll be staying with the Fairbairn family," he told her, his voice carefully neutral. "Celestia runs the post office. Good Christian woman. She'll see you're looked after proper." What he didn't tell her was that Celestia Fairbairn had tried to refuse the arrangement 3 times, and only agreed after finding her prize rooster with its throat cut and a note pinned to her front door. Hospitality is a Christian duty. Miss Clemens began her teaching duties on January 15, 1877, with an enrollment of 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. What struck her immediately was how quiet they were. Mountain children were usually shy with strangers, but this felt different. These children watched her with the focused attention of adults evaluating a potential threat. Among her pupils was 12-year-old Sarah Granville, whose father Solomon had warned her never to walk alone in the woods. 8-year-old Timothy Eastchurch, who flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly. And most unsettling of all, a pale, dark-haired girl who gave her name as Agnes Whitmore and claimed to be visiting relatives in the area. Miss Clemens didn't recognize the child from any of the local families she'd met, but when she asked Celestia Fairbairn about Agnes, the postmistress grew visibly uncomfortable. "Some children move around a lot in these mountains," Celestia said quickly. "Family arrangements get complicated when times are hard." Agnes Whitmore was, of course, Agatha Penrose, the surviving Netherwood child who'd escaped Agent Whitlow's raid. Her presence in the schoolhouse wasn't coincidence. It was reconnaissance. For 3 weeks, Miss Clemens taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to children who already knew far more about death than any textbook could teach them. She noticed odd things, how the children always left together, never staying behind for extra help, how they seemed to communicate without speaking, sharing glances that carried complex messages. How young Agnes would sometimes smile at nothing, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Then came February 6th, 1877, the day Miss Clemens made her fatal mistake. During the lunch recess, she discovered Agnes writing in a small leather journal instead of eating. When the teacher asked to see what she was working on, the child's response was immediate and chilling. "I'm practicing my letters by writing down what people taste like." The journal, which Miss Clemens confiscated, contained detailed observations written in a child's careful script. Mrs. Fairbairn, probably tough. Too much worry. Mr. Forty, black stone. Sweet like whiskey, but bitter underneath. Teacher lady soft, like she never worked hard. Good for soup. That evening, Miss Clemens confronted Celestia Fairbairn with the journal. The postmistress read 3 pages before her face went white as winter frost. "You need to leave," Celestia whispered. "Tonight. Don't pack. Don't say goodbye. Just go." "I can't abandon these children," Miss Clemens protested. "Especially not that poor girl. She's clearly been traumatized by something terrible." Death was coming to dinner. What Miss Clemens couldn't have known was that her discovery of the journal had triggered a carefully prepared response. Within hours of her conversation with Celestia, smoke signals were rising from 3 different mountaintops, an old Cherokee communication system that the Netherwood network had adapted for their own purposes. The signals meant, "Teacher knows too much. Activate final protocol." By midnight, figures were moving through the woods around Hollowbend. Not just Agatha and Selena, but other members of the network who traveled from as far as Kentucky and Virginia. The federal government's withdrawal from the mountains had left a power vacuum, and the Netherwoods intended to fill it. At 2:30 a.m. on February 7th, Miss Clemens woke to find Agnes Whitmore standing beside her bed in the Fairbairn guest room. The child's nightgown was clean and white, her hair neatly braided, but her eyes held the calculating gleam of a predator sizing up prey. "I came to collect my journal," Agnes said politely, "and to thank you for being such a good teacher." Miss Clemens reached for the journal on her nightstand, but Agnes stopped her with a gentle touch. "That's not how we collect things in our family," the child explained. "We take everything." The screaming that followed woke half the settlement, but no one came to investigate. They'd learned, over the past few months, that curiosity could be fatal. Instead, they lay in their beds, pulled their covers over their heads, and pretended they heard nothing but wind. By morning, the schoolhouse stood empty again, its door hanging open, chalk dust swirling in the mountain breeze. Miss Clemens's trunk remained in the Fairbairn house. Her lesson plans still spread across the kitchen table, but the teacher herself had vanished, as completely as if she'd never existed. The only trace of her fate was found by young Timothy Eastchurch, who discovered her spectacles hanging from a tree branch near the old Cherokee hunting grounds, cracked and splattered with something dark. But here's what made this disappearance different from all the others. Agnes Whitmore had made a mistake. In her eagerness to eliminate the threat Miss Clemens represented, she'd acted without her elder's permission. And in the Netherwood family, unauthorized kills carried a price that even children had to pay. The real horror was just beginning. The child's punishment began at dawn, but the screaming didn't start until they brought out the branding iron. In the Netherwood family, unauthorized kills weren't just mistakes. They were theft from the clan's collective harvest. What happened next would teach the residents of Hollowbend that there were worse things than being hunted by the family, being caught between them when they turned on each other. The morning mist rose from the valley floor like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying the acrid smell of burned wood and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Deep in the Cherokee hunting grounds, where federal agents feared to tread and local trackers refused to follow, the surviving members of the Netherwood network had gathered for what they called a family meeting. The clearing they'd chosen had been used for such purposes before circles of stones marked spots where previous transgressions had been addressed, and the ground was dark with stains that decades of mountain rain had never quite washed clean. Selena Drayton, the pale woman who'd claimed to be Cyrus's mail-order bride, stood at the center of the circle, with the authority that came from being the eldest surviving member. Her face bore fresh scars from Agent Whitlow's raid, but her eyes held the cold calculation of a woman who'd been making life and death decisions since before some of her family had been born. Around the circle stood the network's regional representatives, Matthias Culpepper's actual killer, a gaunt man who gave his name as Isaiah Brimstone, the Kentucky contingent led by a woman called Mother Hemlock, and 3 Tennessee mountain families who'd been feeding information and victims to the Netherwoods for over a decade. At Selena's feet, bound with hemp rope and gagged with her own hair ribbon, lay 12-year-old Agatha Penrose, the child who'd been playing the role of innocent Agnes Whitmore, now faced judgment for the crime of acting without permission. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted exactly 17 minutes. Child took what wasn't hers to take, Selena announced to the assembled clan. Teacher woman was marked for harvest, but timing wasn't set. Girl moved too quick, made too much noise, brought attention we can't afford. Isaiah Brimstone spat tobacco juice into the fire. In Kentucky, we just put her down and be done with it. Can't have family members going rogue. But Mother Hemlock, whose weathered face suggested she'd been making these decisions longer than anyone present, shook her head. Girl's got talent. Saw how she handled that teacher. Clean, quiet, no unnecessary mess. Just needs proper guidance. What followed was a debate that revealed the true structure of the Netherwood network. This wasn't a random collection of mountain psychopaths. It was an organized criminal enterprise with rules, territories, and a hierarchy that had been evolving for generations. The network operated on a system of quotas and territories. Each family group was responsible for a specific geographic area and expected to provide a certain number of harvests per year to maintain their standing. Victims were carefully selected to avoid detection. Drifters, federal agents, traveling merchants, and other outsiders who wouldn't be immediately missed. But the system required discipline, coordination, and above all, patience. Family justice has its own rules. Agatha's unauthorized kill had violated multiple protocols. She'd acted during a period when the network was supposed to be laying low after the federal raid. She'd targeted someone with local connections who would be missed quickly. And worst of all, she'd done it on her own initiative, without clearing it through the proper channels. The punishment, when it came, was swift and educational. They didn't kill her. Instead, they marked her a brand burned into her left shoulder that would identify her as a rogue operator to any network member she encountered. The brand was designed to be visible, but not immediately obvious, hidden beneath clothing but revealed whenever she undressed or bathed. More importantly, they assigned her a handler. Mother Hemlock would take custody of the child and train her properly in Kentucky, away from the Hollowbend territory that had become too dangerous for network operations. But before they could relocate their operations, they had one final piece of business to complete. Miss Clemens' disappearance had been noticed, despite their precautions. Celestia Fairbairn had sent inquiries to the county education board, and there were rumors that another federal investigation might be launched. The network needed to provide a plausible explanation for the teacher's fate, one that would satisfy the authorities without revealing the truth. The solution they devised was elegantly simple. They would stage a tragic accident. On February 14, 1877, search parties would discover Miss Clemens's body in a remote ravine, apparently the victim of a fall during a nature walk. Her injuries would be consistent with the story. Her personal effects would be found nearby, and there would be no evidence of foul play. What the searchers wouldn't know was that the body had been prepared weeks in advance, carefully preserved in the network's mountain hideouts, and strategically injured to support the accidental death narrative. The plan required precise timing, careful staging, and the cooperation of several Hollowbend residents who'd learned that asking too many questions could be hazardous to their health. Vernon Blackstone would organize the search party and ensure they found the body in the right location. Celestia Fairbairn would provide testimony about the teacher's habit of taking solitary walks. Dr. Amelia Rathborn would conduct a cursory examination and declare the death accidental. Everyone would play their part, just as they had for years, because the alternative was joining Miss Clemens in her mountain grave. But there was one factor the network hadn't accounted for, one variable that would unravel their carefully laid plans and bring the full weight of federal justice down on their mountain sanctuary. Someone had been watching them. Someone had seen the family meeting, witnessed Agatha's punishment, and overheard their plans for staging Miss Clemens's death. And that someone was about to make a choice that would change everything. Blood soaked through the bandages on Agatha's shoulder, but the real wound was to the network's carefully maintained secrecy. The man crouched behind the rhododendron thicket had seen everything, and his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent any longer. What happened next would prove that even in the lawless mountains, some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. The witness was Percival Ravenscroft, the traveling preacher who'd arrived in Hollowbend the previous October seeking souls to save. But instead of finding redemption in the mountains, he discovered something that challenged every belief he'd held about human nature and divine justice. The February cold bit through his woolen coat as he made his way down the mountain trail, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed in the Cherokee hunting grounds. Ravenscroft had been tracking the network for months, not as an investigator, but as a man of God, trying to understand how such evil could flourish in his Lord's creation. He'd followed rumors and whispers, pieced together fragments of overheard conversations, and gradually assembled a picture of organized horror that stretched across multiple states. The family meeting had confirmed his worst fears and given him information that could finally bring justice to the mountains. Unlike the federal agents who'd tried to infiltrate the network through official channels, Ravenscroft had a different kind of authority. As a circuit preacher, he moved freely between communities, carrying news and messages across vast distances. More importantly, he had contacts in every mountain settlement from Virginia to Alabama, a communication network that predated and surpassed anything the government had established. By February 16, 1877, coded messages were flowing through church networks across the Appalachian region. The code was simple, but effective. Requests for prayers for lost sheep in specific locations, biblical references that pinpointed geographic coordinates, and hymn selections that indicated the level of danger. The message was clear. The wolf pack had been located, and it was time for the shepherds to act. What Ravenscroft had learned from the family meeting went beyond individual crimes. The Netherwood network wasn't just a collection of serial killers. It was a systematic operation that had been harvesting human victims for generations, operating with the complicity of local officials and the protection of geographic isolation. But most damning of all, Ravenscroft had overheard their plans for Miss Clemens's staged death, complete with the date, location, and methods they intended to use. The trap was about to be sprung. Dr. Thackeray Blakemore, the federal marshal who'd been investigating agent disappearances from his base in Knoxville, received Ravenscroft's message on February 18th through a network of Methodist ministers who'd been passing information along the church circuit. The message was embedded in a request for hymnals, 47 copies of Shall We Gather at the River Needed for Revival on 21st, near Hollowbend. Expect large crowd of lost souls seeking redemption. Blakemore understood immediately. Hymn 47 in the Methodist songbook was the Day of Judgment, and the 21st was the date the network planned to stage Miss Clemens's accidental death. The reference to lost souls meant multiple targets would be present. For the first time since Agent Whitlow's raid, federal authorities would have advance notice of network operations. Blakemore assembled a strike force of 12 marshals, all experienced mountain fighters who understood the terrain and the dangers they'd be facing. Unlike previous operations, this wouldn't be an investigation. It would be a military-style assault, designed to capture or eliminate the entire leadership structure. They moved into position on February 20th, establishing observation posts around the ravine where Miss Clemens's body was scheduled to be discovered. What they found there defied their worst expectations. The network had been using the location for years, possibly decades, hidden beneath years of fallen leaves and mountain debris. The marshals discovered a charnel house that made Agent Whitlow's findings look like amateur work. Carefully constructed stone chambers held the preserved remains of dozens of victims, organized by date and method of death with the obsessive precision of a medical collection. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Some secrets never stay buried. Among the preserved remains, Marshal Blakemore found the bodies of 7 federal agents, including Matthias Culpepper. They hadn't been simply murdered. They'd been systematically dissected, studied, and cataloged like specimens in some nightmarish research project. The Netherwood network wasn't just killing federal agents. They were learning from them, studying government methods and techniques to improve their own operations. A leather-bound journal found among the remains contained detailed analyses of federal investigation procedures, agent communication protocols, and bureaucratic weaknesses that could be exploited. The network had been using dead agents as teachers, extracting information from their bodies and belongings to stay ahead of government pursuit. On February 21st, at exactly 10:15 a.m., the network's carefully planned deception walked straight into a federal ambush. Selena Drayton, Isaiah Brimstone, and 6 other network leaders arrived at the ravine to stage Miss Clemens's accidental death, only to find themselves surrounded by federal marshals with shoot-to-kill orders. The gunfight lasted 7 minutes and ended with 4 network leaders dead and the rest in federal custody. But even as the shooting died away, Marshal Blakemore realized they'd won only a partial victory. Mother Hemlock and young Agatha were nowhere to be found. The Kentucky and Tennessee contingents had apparently suspected a trap and stayed away. And most troubling of all, documents recovered from the site suggested the network was far larger than anyone had imagined, with cells operating as far south as Georgia and as far north as Pennsylvania. The Hollowbend network had been broken, but the larger organization remained intact. And somewhere in the Kentucky mountains, a 12-year-old girl with a brand on her shoulder was learning new lessons in patience, planning, and revenge. What would you do if you knew monsters walked among your neighbors, but speaking out meant becoming their next victim? The residents of Hollowbend had learned to look the other way, to ask no questions, and to be grateful for small mercies. But their silence had enabled horrors that would haunt the mountains for generations to come. The network was wounded, not destroyed, and wounded predators are often the most dangerous of all. The gun smoke had barely cleared from the Hollowbend ambush when new orders began flowing through the mountain telegraph. But these weren't calls for revenge. They were instructions for evolution. The federal raid had taught the network a lesson that would make them far more dangerous than they'd ever been before. Visibility meant death, but invisibility meant survival. The autumn of 1877 brought changes to the Appalachian Mountains that most residents didn't immediately recognize. The scent of wood smoke carried differently on the wind, no longer thick with the smell of cured meat. The sounds of the forest shifted subtly. Fewer hunting dogs baying in the distance, more silence where there should have been life. And in Kentucky, far from the scorched earth of Hollowbend, a 12-year-old girl with a brand on her shoulder was learning lessons that would reshape the entire network. Mother Hemlock's compound sat in a natural bowl between 3 ridges, accessible only through caves that had been carved by underground streams over thousands of years. The Cherokee had considered the place cursed, but Mother Hemlock understood that what frightened others could protect those willing to embrace the darkness. Under her tutelage, young Agatha Penrose was being transformed from an impulsive child killer into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The lessons began before dawn each day and continued until long after sunset, covering everything from anatomy and chemistry to psychology and social manipulation. The old ways got us noticed, Mother Hemlock explained as she demonstrated the proper technique for dissolving bone and lye. Your grandfather Cyrus thought fear was enough to keep people quiet, but fear makes people desperate, and desperate people talk to federal agents. The new methodology was elegantly simple. Instead of terrorizing entire communities into silence, the network would integrate seamlessly into them. Members would become respected community leaders, doctors, teachers, lawmen, preachers, people whose word carried weight, and whose disappearance would be investigated thoroughly. This approach required a completely different skill set. Network operatives needed to be intelligent, charming, and above all, patient. They had to be able to maintain their cover identities for years or even decades before activating for their true purpose. The shadows have eyes now. By 1878, the restructured network had established cells in over 40 communities across 7 states. But these weren't the crude family groups that had operated around Hollowbend. These were sophisticated operations run by individuals who'd spent months or years establishing themselves as pillars of their communities. Dr. Ambrose Finch, the beloved physician of Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, who'd saved dozens of lives during the cholera outbreak of 1879. Few of his grateful patients suspected that he'd also been carefully selecting which travelers passing through town would never reach their destinations. Reverend Josiah Blackwood, whose passionate sermons about redemption and forgiveness had revitalized 3 different congregations across Virginia. His parishioners never questioned why so many drifters and vagrants seemed to find salvation in his church and then disappear entirely. Sheriff Margaret Crowley, the first woman elected to law enforcement in her Kentucky county, who'd earned respect for her tireless work protecting local families from outside threats. The traveling merchants and federal agents who vanished in her jurisdiction were simply casualties of the dangerous mountain terrain. The network's new structure solved the visibility problem that had destroyed the Hollowbend operation, but it created a different challenge: coordination. With cells operating independently across hundreds of miles, maintaining communication and preventing conflicts required an entirely new approach. Mother Hemlock's solution was revolutionary for its time. She created what amounted to a criminal franchise system. Each cell operated under shared protocols and procedures, but with complete autonomy in their local operations. Communication flowed through established, legitimate channels: church networks, medical conferences, law enforcement associations that no federal agent would think to monitor. The system was tested in 1880 when a federal task force, led by Marshal Blakemore, launched a coordinated sweep of mountain communities suspected of harboring network remnants. They found nothing but helpful local officials, concerned citizens, and detailed records showing that missing persons had either moved on voluntarily or fallen victim to the region's genuinely hazardous terrain. But the real proof of the network's evolution came with something far more sophisticated than simple murder. They began recruiting. The recruitment process was methodical and psychological. Potential members were identified during moments of crisis: the death of a loved one, financial ruin, social ostracism, when they were most vulnerable to offers of power and belonging. The network's respectable community leaders would approach these broken individuals with sympathy, support, and eventually, opportunity. Dr. Finch might console a widow whose husband had been killed in a mining accident, gradually drawing her into his confidence until she was ready to help him identify which patients would be missed least. Reverend Blackwood would counsel a man whose family had been destroyed by scandal, slowly guiding him toward the realization that some people deserved punishment for their sins. The process could take months or even years, but it produced converts who were completely committed to the network's cause because they believed they'd chosen it freely. By 1885, the network had grown from a regional criminal organization into something approaching a secret society, with initiations, ranks, and a complex mythology that justified their actions as necessary for the preservation of mountain culture against federal interference. New members were taught that they were part of an ancient tradition, guardians of the old ways against the encroachment of outside civilization. They learned that their victims weren't murders, but sacrifices, offerings to preserve the balance between the civilized world and the wild places that still belong to older, darker powers. The mythology wasn't just recruitment propaganda. The network's leaders had begun to believe it themselves, and that belief would drive them to attempt something that would either establish their dominance over the mountains forever or destroy them more completely than any federal raid ever could. But the most dangerous evolution in the network structure was also the most subtle. They'd learned to hide in plain sight by becoming the very authorities tasked with stopping them. When the next federal investigation came to the mountains, it would be led by people who'd already chosen which side of the hunt they were really on. The federal agent's badge was real, but the woman wearing it had been hunting humans since she was 12 years old. By 1923, the network had achieved something no criminal organization in American history had managed. They'd become the law. What started as a survival strategy had evolved into the perfect predatory system, one that could operate indefinitely because the hunters and the hunted were now the same people. The oak trees around the abandoned Hollowbend settlement whispered with autumn wind, their branches heavy with the weight of decades and the memory of screams that had long since faded. Special Agent Agnes Whitmore, the name she'd legally adopted after years of careful identity construction, stood in the ruins of what had once been the Netherwood compound, reviewing a case file that would officially close the longest-running federal investigation in American history. The morning air carried the scent of dying leaves and rich soil, while frost crunched beneath her polished shoes, with the same sound it had made 46 years earlier, when she'd been a branded child learning the cost of impatience. But Agatha Penrose had learned her lessons well under Mother Hemlock's guidance, and Agent Whitmore was the perfect culmination of those teachings. The report in her hands would conclude that the Netherwood network had been completely destroyed in the 1870s, its members killed or scattered, its operations permanently disbanded. The few remaining questions about missing persons and unexplained deaths would be attributed to the harsh realities of frontier life bandits, wild animals, and the unforgiving mountain terrain. No one would ever know that the network hadn't been destroyed. It had simply evolved beyond recognition. The transformation had taken 50 years to complete, but the results were flawless. Network operatives now held positions of authority in law enforcement, government, medicine, and education across 7 states. They investigated their own crimes, treated their own victims, and educated the children, who would grow up never questioning the official explanations for why certain people simply vanished. Dr. Margaret Finch, daughter of the beloved Tennessee physician who ran the state medical examiner's office and ensured that suspicious deaths received the proper interpretations. Judge Solomon Blackwood, son of the charismatic Virginia preacher, whose court decisions protected network operations under the guise of preserving mountain traditions and local autonomy. Most importantly, there was Agent Agnes Whitmore herself, now the federal government's leading expert on organized crime in rural America, whose recommendations shaped policy and determined which cases received serious investigation. The network had learned the ultimate lesson of survival. The most effective way to avoid being hunted was to become the hunter. But the 1920s brought new challenges that tested even their sophisticated systems. Modern communication, improved transportation, and federal agencies with expanded jurisdiction made the old territorial boundaries increasingly meaningless. The network needed to adapt again, or risk exposure by investigators who couldn't be controlled or corrupted. Agent Whitmore's solution was characteristically elegant. Instead of fighting modernization, the network would use it to expand their operations nationwide. The key was understanding that America in the 1920s was a country in transition, full of displaced people, broken families, and individuals whose disappearances wouldn't generate sustained investigation. The economic boom had created vast numbers of transient workers, while Prohibition had normalized criminal activity and police corruption. Under Whitmore's guidance, the network established what they called traveling operations, Mobile units that followed seasonal work patterns, targeting migrant laborers, traveling salesmen, and other people whose absence wouldn't be noticed until long after the perpetrators had moved on. The system was tested during the harvest season of 1924, when network operatives embedded themselves among the crews picking fruit in California's Central Valley. Over 3 months, 17 workers vanished without trace, their disappearances attributed to the normal turnover of seasonal labor. Some hunts never end. But the network's greatest achievement wasn't operational, it was philosophical. By the 1930s, they'd developed a complete ideology that justified their actions not as crimes, but as a form of social service. They weren't murderers, they were selectors, removing weak and unproductive members from society to strengthen the whole. This ideology attracted new recruits from unexpected sources. University professors who believed in eugenics, business leaders who viewed certain populations as economic burdens, and government officials who saw the network's activities as an unofficial solution to social problems that couldn't be addressed through legal channels. The network had become something far more dangerous than a criminal organization. They'd become a shadow institution with their own theories of justice, selection, and social improvement. World War II provided the perfect testing ground for their expanded operations. With millions of people displaced by military service, industrial mobilization, and population shifts, the network found unprecedented opportunities to operate without detection. Factory workers, military deserters, and refugees provided a steady supply of victims whose disappearances could be explained by the chaos of wartime. Agent Whitmore, now a senior federal administrator, helped coordinate population management programs that officially tracked displaced persons, but actually identified targets for network operations. The same bureaucratic efficiency that won the war also enabled systematic murder on a scale that would have impressed the Netherwood founders. By 1950, the network had achieved complete institutional integration. They were no longer outsiders preying on society. They were society, at least the parts of it that made decisions about who lived, who died, and who would be missed. But success brought its own risks. The larger and more sophisticated the network became, the more likely it was that someone would eventually recognize the patterns, ask the right questions, or discover evidence that couldn't be suppressed or explained away. The final evolution came in the 1960s, when Agent Whitmore, now Director Whitmore, made the decision that would ensure the network's survival for generations to come. They stopped killing people directly. Instead, they became architects of systems that produced the same results through apparently natural causes. Industrial accidents, medical malpractice, bureaucratic negligence, and policy decisions that condemned certain populations to poverty, disease, and early death. Why hunt individuals when you could harvest entire communities through perfectly legal means? The network's modern form bears no resemblance to the crude mountain families that terrorized Hollowbend in the 1870s. Today's operatives don't need to hide bodies or stage accidents. They simply ensure that certain people never receive the medical care, legal representation, or economic opportunities they need to survive. But do they still exist? In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, locals whisper about government officials who ask too many questions about family histories, medical researchers who seem unusually interested in genetic isolation, and social workers whose intervention somehow makes problems worse instead of better. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.